First, I want to congratulate you on receiving the Wooden Award, and certainly you exemplify the values that people have talked about this evening. And I am sure that he would be very proud of you.
Well, thank you, Ken. I'm just honored to be with you and all the people here today, particularly the people from the Anderson School here at UCLA, but to follow in your footsteps and the footsteps of all these great CEOs is such a huge honor.
So Ken, I'm going to ask you a few questions here.
Okay.
And I'd sort of like to start at the beginning. You're a North Philly kid.
Yeah.
You're very proud that you're from North Philly.
Yes. For those of you who don't know where North Philly is, it's what's now nicely called the inner city of Philadelphia.
So one thing I know clearly is that your parents were a major influence on your life. Your mother died when you were 12. Mm-hmm. Your father then became a single parent and raised you and your siblings. And the way you talk about your father and the values that he imbued in you is really powerful. And so one of the things that I'd like to start with is, how did your family help shape you and your values? And walk us through the journey of this kid from North Philly becoming chairman and CEO of Merck. Talk a little bit about what your dreams and aspirations were when you were growing up. Did you think you'd be where you are now? Talk about that a little bit.
So let me start with the last question. Absolutely not. I did not think I would be where I am now, but I will say, you talked about my father. I think my father, who, if he were alive today, would be just short of his 122nd birthday. He was born in 1900. I would say that this is all possible because he believed firmly that in this country, I would have opportunities greater than the opportunities that a black child born in South Carolina at the turn of the 20th century in 1900 would have. So to answer your question, I think I was very fortunate to have two parents who saw in their children limitless possibilities. And not only did they see it, but they demanded that you live up to their standards. And, you know, my father, you mentioned, you know, it's not easy to have a single parent father be raised. I could say my father was not a very sentimental man about his children. He was very demanding, loving, but in a demanding way. And the way that I think Coach Wooden was of his players, holding us to very, very high standards. The other thing I would say about my upbringing is that, you know, education is the great equalizer in our society, and it is the source of great opportunity, particularly in a knowledge society. My younger sister and I came along in the birth order where it had become the approach of the social engineers in Philadelphia to take poor black kids, a small number of poor black kids from what was then called the ghetto, put them on buses and ship them off to really good schools. That was called school desegregation, not to be confused with integration, because it was just a small number of black kids going to the very best schools. And I have to say, looking back on that, I got an education that was rigorous. And the sad thing is that for too many kids in this country, that kind of education is not what they can expect, simply because their parents and guardians can't afford real estate that's proximate to where the good schools are. So I got to take a bus 90 minutes to where the good schools were. I didn't love it. I felt like a stranger in a strange land. But everything that's ever happened to me, I trace back to the good fortune of being given that educational opportunity and having the parents that I had.
That's great, Ken. So you were obviously someone who excelled academically. You went to Penn State when you were 16. You've faced challenges in your career, but talk about some of your role models. And I know your father, as you said, was an incredible role model for you, but talk about some of your personal role models on the pathway And who were some of your role models in business?
Okay. So let me start by saying I went to law school because my role model growing up was Thurgood Marshall, who became a Supreme Court justice, but he was my role model because he had been the lawyer who led a hardy band of lawyers who desegregated the South. I was born in 1954, a few months after Brown versus Board of Education, the case that basically said that separate but equal in the context of education was unconstitutional. Well, that was Justice Marshall's case. And early in my legal career, I got to work with another person that Bill Coleman,
Yes.
who was a great lawyer who wrote that brief.
Right.
And so I was very fortunate to be surrounded by real giants in the legal profession. When I moved over to the business side, I also had the great good fortune of working for a terrific CEO at Merck named Roy Vagelos. Yes. And Roy Vagelos was a physician scientist who became the CEO of Merck, and Merck had been most admired for like 7 or 8 years in a row. We're talking back in the late 80s, early 90s, where there was no Amazon and there was no Google. And so Merck stood out as a company that really was a great innovator. And he led the company, and he led it based on values. And he called me one day and asked me to come to the company. He said that as he was getting towards the end of his career, he only had the opportunity to make one more person's career. And he said, guess what? It's going to be your career. And I wasn't ready to do that. I was a lawyer. I loved being a lawyer. I loved being in the courtroom. It was very exciting. I had opportunities to do fabulous cases, including death penalty work in the South. I loved it. And I was going to turn him down, but my wife, Andrea, who's sitting back there, who's much the wiser of the two of us.
Absolutely.
Once again, it's all about opportunity. She heard the opportunity in what he was offering me. So I came to the company and he said, I know you're a lawyer, but I want you to learn the business. And so eventually I got promoted to a position where I ran the commercial business of Merck. And another mentor of mine, Ken Chenault, who I went to law school. Ken's 2 years ahead of me in law school, but light years ahead of me in business.
Not at all.
I was in my job maybe 2 weeks, and the phone rang, and my secretary said, this guy named Ken Chenault said you ought to have lunch with him. Come over and have lunch with him. She said, why can't he come over and lunch with you? And this is a true story. I don't know if I ever told you the story.
No, you didn't.
I went over, and you were on the cover of Fortune about that time.
Right.
I picked it up, and I said to her, this Ken Chenault? And so I was, again, I had the great fortune of being able to go visit Ken on a regular basis as he was the CEO of Merck. And while I didn't have the pleasure and the privilege of going to a school like the Anderson School here, I got what really was the core of what I needed to learn about business as I made the transition from all the meetings that we had. So thank you, Ken.
Well, thank you, Ken. You more than exceeded all the expectations. You've used a term that I can't imagine many other CEOs using. And you talk about corporate soul. Now, you're certainly a mission-driven leader, but I think it would be interesting to hear about what you mean about corporate soul, and very importantly, talk about how you have used values in your leadership of Merck.
So when I use the phrase corporate soul, and I think people usually sort of sit up when you say that, because how can a company have a soul, right? But I think that there's two elements to that, and the first one of which is purpose. The company has a purpose, and the purpose is more than simply to be a vehicle for wealth creation. Although obviously we have shareholders, and we are there to meet the needs of our shareholders and give them a return on their investment. Our company exists to alleviate human suffering around the world. And the people who come to work every day at Merck really believe in that statement of purpose. So having a statement of purpose is a part of it, but what's more important than having a statement of purpose is whether the behaviors and the strategies and the actions of the company are really aligned with those purposes. Every company has a great value statement. But what matters to our customers, to our employees, to others, is whether we live. So it's the first thing is that sense of purpose. The second thing is, do you have a conscience? When you're tempted to do something that is inconsistent with those purposes or inconsistent with the greater needs of society, does the company have a conscience? Is it driven, again, by more than just the ability to create wealth? So that's what I mean by soul. Is it motivated by some internal drive to do something good in the world? And you talked about values leadership, and that's what John Wooden is about to me. As a basketball coach, I grew up in Philadelphia. I mentioned to you that, my minister, Reverend Hazard's son, Walt Hazard, was the star of his first championship team. I was a young kid, and so I started paying attention to UCLA because my minister's son was a star in 1965, okay, when I was 10 years old. But what I learned about him through the years is this concept that leadership is really about values. It's not about your own personality or how you project it to people, although a lot of leaders have big egos. If you're able to inspire and motivate people, it's because you're articulating values that they themselves believe in. I think that businesses are a lot like going to the supermarket. There are a lot of different aisles in the supermarket, and you can choose whether you're going to the candy aisle or the produce aisle. And the same with businesses. Companies that live their values attract people. And that's one of the things Coach Wooden said. Good people are attracted by good values.
Absolutely. So one of the timely issues right now is the role of CEOs in our society. And there are some people who have said, look, businesses should just stick to business. They should not be involved in any issues facing our society. Just focus on the business, treat your people well, but don't get involved in any issues outside of your business. Ken, how do you think about that? How do you, again, use values and principles to guide you? We have the Russian-Ukraine situation. What should CEOs do? You had voting rights. You took a stand in Charlottesville. Talk a little bit about not only what you've done, but how you think CEOs should act with respect to the broader society.
So I say, first of all, this is a really difficult issue for CEOs because, our country is so divided and our world is so divided that taking a stand means that you're prepared to alienate someone and some large group of people. So stepping down, for example, from President Trump's business council, I got a lot of hate mail about that. But I think it really comes down to something very simple, and that is doing what you think is right. I think that's the most important thing. And there's surveys out there that show that the public actually looks to business leaders, accords them more credibility, for example, than political leaders, or even religious leaders. Maybe that shouldn't be the case, but we do have a position where we can take a stand, not just with our employees, but with the broader society. And so from my perspective, you've got to think about, your own platform. You've got to use it judiciously. You can't use it on every single issue. But when certain issues come up, like, for example, you and I actually worked together on the voting rights issue. This time last year, I remember.
So take folks behind the conversations, what happened, why you took a stand, how you communicated that inside Merck and to your board.
So it was just about this time last year. I remember because it was a Sunday afternoon and I think we were down to the Elite Eight in the tournament. And I just sat back and I was like, I'm going to watch a good afternoon's worth of basketball. And the phone rang and, I don't remember exactly what it was one of our friends, Bill Lewis, called and said, I think we need to have a conversation about this law in Georgia. And I had been aware of the law in Georgia, and I knew that I had real concerns about it. You and I both work with the Legal Defense Fund, and so we knew that there were issues. But Bill was saying, there are people in the outside world who are thinking that African-American business leaders should not be silent in the face of this law. So we got on the phone, a bunch of people, and we had a discussion about whether we should take a stand. Now look, for every one of us, there are 5 African-American CEOs out of the Fortune 500. We're putting ourselves in a position where we're going to be uniquely looked at under incredible scrutiny if we do this. And yet, I think each of us thought that this was an opportunity and a commitment that we needed to make to speaking about what was really right. And then after that, so there was a full-page ad we took out with African-American leaders. And then the question became, is it only the case that African-American leaders care about voting rights, or is this something that's broader? And so we asked the broader business community whether or not they wanted to take a stand. And by the way, if you looked at the full-page ads that we took out, in many ways, the language in those ads was what children used to be taught in civics. It should not have been controversial to say things like, people who are eligible voters should be able to vote without interference. Or people who are not eligible to vote should not be able to cast votes and therefore to create an issue in the election. So we talked about those things. Most people call those sort of anodyne, basic issues, but it was very controversial because we knew, and those CEOs, many of whom are on the back wall who signed this letter, knew that we were going to be criticized because our country is so divided. But that doesn't mean that we should be looking to stay out of controversy, I saw a survey recently of Gen Z people that said 90% of Gen Z people want to work for a company where the company takes stands on important issues. We saw recently, with respect to the so-called Don't Say Gay law in Florida, that one of the prominent company that has a really large business in Florida tried to stay out of it. I'm not going to mention them. Right. I think they have a park near here too. Right. I've heard that. But that just shows that you have expectations of your employees. They want to believe that their company has values. The Russia thing, right? A lot of us have businesses in Russia. But we have to ask ourselves, given the invasion of Ukraine and what we're seeing, is there something more important than the profit? And I know a lot of people say the business of business is business and you should mind your business and make your profit. But that assumes that there is nothing more important to the company and its constituencies than maximizing profit. And I've never found that to be true.
Yeah, I think, Ken, very powerful. I think one of the things that is very, very important is the recognition that companies exist because society allows us to exist. Absolutely. So we have a responsibility to society, and if you're focused on the long term, you want to build an enduring company. How can you build an enduring company if you separate yourself from what's happening in society? And so I think the recognition and your actions are a reinforcement, but it's very challenging.
It is.
And I think that what people would be very interested is, given the business challenges of being a CEO and leadership in general, talk about some of the core leadership attributes that you think are most important.
We've been talking about values in Coachwood. I think the most important thing for a leader is that that leader really believes in the core values of the company, and those leaders actually are self-governed by values. It's not just espousing values for others, it's having those values dictate how one lives one's own life. And I think that unless you have those values, I don't think you may be in a position of leadership, a position of power, so to speak, but I don't think you can actually lead people. I think it's the values themselves that motivate and inspire people, and if you're articulating those values. So there's some other things that are really important. It does take a certain amount of courage to be in this position. It's a lonely position, particularly when you get to the very top. You're always being asked to do things, and there are people who have different ideas about what's right or wrong inside the company. And you want to take advice from your colleagues, your board, et cetera. But ultimately, you have to decide what's right for the company. And you have to decide what's right, as you said, Ken, not just for the short term, but for the long term. I think the last thing I would say, I mean, there's many things that are important about leadership. But the last thing I would say, it's very important, and I think Coach Wooden showed this too, is you really have to care about your people. You have to care about your customers. In our business, our customers often are patients who are sick, who are looking to us to bring forward medicines that extend and improve and even save people's lives. And unless you have the empathy and the compassion to care about those people, then you can't lead. An example I would give is one that got referred to earlier, which is the work that we did about an Ebola vaccine. You know, we knew that if we invested significant amount of corporate resources in developing an Ebola vaccine, we would never make a profit from it, because Ebola happened to affect a portion of humanity that doesn't have the ability to pay for it. And ultimately what it comes down to is, do you live your own values? Do you really care about those people's lives enough to invest in them? Or as one of my friends said to me, it pretty much comes down to you whether you believe in the afterlife.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Ken, talk about one or two of the most difficult decisions that you had to make at Merck.
Okay.
And then I think people would like to hear, what do you feel most proud about that you accomplished at Merck?
So I think the first thing that was one of the hardest decisions I made, and it happened to be made in the first month of the job, was at that point in time, there was a lot of pressure being placed on CEOs of drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, to cut their research budgets and to return more money to shareholders. And I was a new CEO, and my investors made that clear to me. In fact, in our case, we had long-term earnings guidance that was out, extended.
And if I can interrupt,
Yep.
just for people, there was clearly comments of this new CEO taking this action. Did he know what he was doing?
Right.
So I actually had peer CEOs call me and say, I know you know Ken, I gotta tell you, your boy is really, he's made a really crazy call here.
Right.
So at the time, for people to understand, Ken was under a lot of heat.
No question. But again, you have to ask yourself, what are the fundamental values of the company that you're running? And for Merck has always been a company that's been dedicated to scientific excellence. And the success of the company comes down to doing really great science. And you can't do great science unless you can recruit and retain great scientists. And so they're watching to see ultimately who your master is. Is your master the company's values, including scientific excellence? Or are you really trying to please a very loud, aggressive audience on Wall Street? So that was a very hard decision to make in the first month, because I had no track record, and I didn't want to get fired in 1 month. My wife hadn't been able to redo the kitchen yet. So that was a real hard decision, I would say. I think another really hard decision that came up, we've talked about it, is, when I decided not to stick to the president's counsel.
Right.
This was early in the Trump administration, and people thought there would be reprisals.
And talk about why.
Okay, so we all know that an issue came up in Charlottesville. You know, there were marches. There were people who were marching and was chanting, you know, sort of Nazi slogans, and the young woman was unfortunately killed. I don't want to get into all the things that the president said, but I felt like they were not expressing the values that we have as a country. And so the question is, as the CEO of Merck, a company where the government is our largest customer, are you going to piss off the President of the United States? And a president who I think most people thought was likely to take that not in a good way. But I was able to calm my board and tell them what I thought was the right thing to do. Les Brunn, my lead director at the time, sitting over here, and I'm very proud to say that the board unanimously said they supported it. I asked the board the question. I said, I'm going to step down because I feel like I owe it to my family and others to show that I will stand up for the principles that I talk about.
Just on a personal level, talk a little bit about how Andrea felt and your son and daughter.
Okay, well, so the reality of the world is...
We got to get to the nitty-gritty, right?
We are a divided country. So the reality of the world is that when the president, who was newly elected, asked me to serve on his business advisory council, going on the council was hard for my family because friends, others were saying, you know, are you going over to the other side? So my daughter was working at Google at the time. My son was in college. Everybody knew I was their father, and you know, I would go down to the White House, and just by coincidence, every time I was positioned right next to the president. So the pictures would be in the newspaper. My daughter would call me from San Francisco saying, Dad, you're killing me. You know, what is this all about?
But talk about what you said to her.
Well,
I'm going to get very personal.
Right, so I felt it was my obligation to the company to be in that room representing what healthcare needed, what pharmaceutical companies needed from the government. But when Charlottesville happened, and this is a true story, my wife and I were in New York. She was shopping for furniture, so I was paying maybe more attention to my iPhone than I normally would. And I saw the comments from the president come across, and we went home, and my son came home from college, and I'll never forget, he said to me, "What's up, Dad? What's up?" Which was his way of saying, what are you going to do? Are you going to stay there? Or are you going to do something that shows that you have these values? And so for me, it was really an easy decision to make, but I asked my board, the question I asked my board is, when I step down, should I make a public statement that said I'm doing it based on my personal values, or should I say it's based on my values and the company's values? And I'm very proud to say that they said, we'd like you to speak on behalf of the company.
So Ken, I want to turn a little bit to OneTen, but I also want to talk about how the idea came about. And I'd like you to do two things. One is you did an interview on CNBC after the murder of George Floyd, and you talked about the murder. And then a few days later, the decision was made to try to create an organization called OneTen. So talk about both your interview, why you did the interview, and also how OneTen came about. And then also, because we have to use some commercial time here,
What OneTen is about.
what OneTen is about. Right.
So, you know, Ken, you're asking me this question, but you've lived this too. There are 5 African-American CEOs in the Fortune 500. Something like this happens, and the business community calls and says, Ken, why are these people out in the streets? Help us understand. Why can't they rely on the criminal justice system to deal with the situation? I have now, because of the position I'm in, I am the CEO of Merck, but rightly or wrongly, I'm expected to speak to those kinds of issues. So I decided that I would go on CNBC and answer the questions that the hosts wanted to ask me and help them understand that, for example, in this instance, and this was very early in the weekend after we started seeing civil unrest, that people had watched what had happened in that situation, and there seemed to be no desire on the part of the local authorities to take action against the police officers. And so I wanted people to understand that, someone who was able to have their neck nailed on for 9 minutes and the community watching there was anger because people said, no one's even taking any action. We're acting like we have to study this for weeks before we make a decision. So following that, a number of CEOs, as you know, began to call up and say, again, because we're a small group of African American CEOs, what do you think business ought to do in light of the civil unrest in the streets? People were really worried that our country was sort of coming apart at that moment. And, businesses can give donations. Businesses can make statements about how horrible this kind of thing is and how much they support diversity. But when they asked what they should do, Ken and I, and another colleague, Charles Phillips at the time, said, you know what businesses really can do? We can hire people. That's in our wheelhouse. That's what companies do. And so recognizing that 76% of African Americans at age 26 do not have a 4-year college degree, we suggested to companies that they look carefully at their job requisitions, their job credentials, and say, how many of these jobs really require a 4-year degree versus how many of them are skills-based jobs? Because that is a structural barrier to 76% of African Americans. And when you go into companies, there are lots of jobs in retail and healthcare and IT that people can be manufacturing, they can be trained to do these jobs. But for many, many years, people would just have reflexively these 4-year job requirements, 4-year college degree requirements, which again, I don't think were intentionally put there, but actually had the effect of preventing people from having an opportunity to have family-sustaining wage jobs. So we proposed to them, and someone said 50 companies, it's 65 now.
That's right.
We've got 65 large companies that are now being introspective and are looking at each job and saying, do we really have to exclude people because they don't have a 4-year degree? And it's not about lowering standards.
Right.
It's about giving opportunity. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I can just say one point, which I think is, to me, exciting about what we're doing is OneTen is like a startup, right, and we're creating an ecosystem to really change how both jobs are created and what the opportunities are. And one of the things, because we think in our society of win-lose, one of the points that we've made is often in business, you focus on certain customer segments. But what you also look for is what's the impact on the broader population? So one of the points we've made to businesses is you're going to change the jobs for everybody.
Right.
So part of what you need to communicate is, here is an example, particularly taken from business. We're focusing on a customer segment, but we've actually increased the size of market because this is going to benefit everyone. And so that's a message that once we put some points on the board, and we started to put a few points, but we got to put a lot of points, that's a message you're also going to hear in connection with OneTen. But go on, Ken.
So as Ken was just saying, what we're trying to do, OneTen stands for this goal of hiring 1 million African Americans who lack a 4-year degree into family-sustaining wage jobs over the next 10 years. And we started well. We got 25,000 last year. We hope to get 100,000 this year. We plan to get 100,000 this year. And as Ken was just saying, I use the analogy sometimes, if you travel around New York City, you'll see that at intersections, there are those cutouts at the curb line that are designed for people who are handicapped with wheelchairs. But if you stand on the corner and watch who uses those cutouts. It's able-bodied people pulling luggage. So when you created a situation where it was possible for handicapped people to cross the intersection, you made it easier for everyone to cross the intersection. And that's what we're really trying to do in this situation. I think it's the most important thing, speaking personally, that I've ever done in my life. Because coming back to my childhood, I was the son of a janitor who had a third-grade education, who worked for United Parcel Service. But in the 50s and 60s, that company paid him a living wage. And so he could raise a family, pay a mortgage, have a used car. Once in a while, we had a vacation. That wasn't impossible. So what we're really trying to do here is make the point that talent is more evenly distributed in our society than opportunity is. And if we can create that opportunity for people, the opportunity for people to have jobs, to hold their heads up high, to feel dignity in their lives, we can bring this country together. It's an opportunity for business. You know, can I just say one quick thing?
You can say anything you want.
You know, I used to teach law school in South Africa during apartheid. And every time I came back to the United States in the 80s, in the early 90s, one of the things that was really clear to me is that, like South Africa, there were racial differences. There were economic differences. But one of the biggest differences, besides the stated creeds we have in the United States, is the importance of the business community. The business community helps reinvent the United States over and over and over again. And so if we're going to fix some of these problems, whether it's climate change or inequalities, business has to play a role. You know, we can't try to deal with people by giving them charity. It's not sustainable. If we can create environments where people can come to work and create value for their companies and for their families, that's a sustainable model.
Absolutely. So, Ken, I'm going to close out with two questions. What's your next chapter? Obviously, OneTen is going to be part of it. But what are you going to do next? You've done so much. How do you think about that next chapter? And then I'd like to close out with really coming full circle for that kid from North Philly. What would be the one word that you would use to summarize your life?
So what comes next? I'm looking at my spouse because I don't have total permission to decide what comes next. But you know, I am learning about the venture capital business, working along with Ken and folks at General Catalyst. And a lot of my friends said, wow, venture capital after Merck. I mean, how could you make that decision? But the fact of the matter is the folks at this organization really believe that there's no inconsistency between creating financial value and creating societal value. And starting up companies with founders who want to make their companies create that dual value is something that I want to help these young people do. And I think that's a very exciting thing. So that's part of what I want to do going forward. You asked me what word I would use to describe my life. I have to say blessed. I was so fortunate. When I look back at my life, I feel like an imposter compared to my next oldest siblings because I came along at a time when educational opportunities were made available to me. I got into the law where I had great mentors and into business where I had great mentors. So all along, I was very fortunate to be guided and sponsored and supported. And that gets back to Coach Wooden. At the end of the day, what he did was he taught his people to support other people. That's what he was about. It wasn't just about winning basketball games. It was about teaching people how to maximize what they could do with their lives. And I am so honored to be here tonight. And I thank you all for this award, and I thank you for your generous listening tonight.